Somebody who knows a lot about this standing by on the acutehearingcenters.com hotline. He's Dr. Murray Cohen, who is an expert in consultation for things like industrial hygiene, workplace safety, infectious diseases. He worked with the CDC in Atlanta. And Dr. Cohen, good afternoon, and thank you for joining us.
Good afternoon, Ken. I'm glad to be here. Thanks for asking me.
All right. Look, there are a couple of things, I think, and the idea of this thing isn't to assess blame. There'll be plenty of blame time for that after we get by what's here. But there is a feeling, and it was certainly evident on Capitol Hill this week, and certainly evident in the president's remarks, that the CDC might have been caught flat-footed on this, and that it wasn't necessarily set up to deal with this kind of a pandemic. Is that a fair criticism of the group you used to work for?
Well, I hate to say it, but yes, indeed it is. CDC today is not the CDC that I worked at 20 years ago. That's all I can say.
Well, and what differences are there? Because are there different disciplines, different people in charge? Why?
Well, it just seems to be much more of a political agency now, as opposed to a scientific agency. It's a much bigger bureaucracy, much bigger physical plant because of a whole bunch of appropriations that were made post-anthrax in the mail. And, that didn't go so much into building science. It went into building facilities. They've got a beautiful campus now in Atlanta with a pond with ducks and geese in the middle, and I was like walking into a big pharmaceutical company in the Northeast. So there's a lot on image, and there's a lot of work being done by contractors as opposed to developing, like when I was there, in-house capabilities in all of the scientific disciplines.
Well, when did it go off the rails? When did they start building edifices and stop dealing with science?
Well, I wouldn't say they stopped dealing with science. I just think that as we see in everything about this particular outbreak, the decisions are being made in a political sense, not in a scientific sense. The announcements are being handled by politicians. It's not just right now. I mean, similar problems occurred with the West African Ebola outbreak in 2014, 2015. Mm-hmm. You were always hearing from Washington, or you were hearing from the CDC director as opposed to the people down in the agency who were the actual experts working with the virus. Yeah. And the same is true today.
Well, on Capitol Hill this week, in particular, a congresswoman from California literally held Robert Redfield, the guy who's now running the CDC, his feet to the fire, asking him very pointed questions about the cost of testing for the coronavirus and what it would mean if a person tested positive and quarantine or hospitalization would be necessary. And he had no answers. And I don't know whether or not the questioning was unfair. Usually when someone testifies in front of Congress, the questioning is unfair because the questioner always knows what the answer is before they ask the question. But he did seem to come off as befuddled. What is this guy Redfield up to the task, in your opinion?
In my opinion, absolutely not. I'm trying to think what I can say on live radio and not have people come after me.
Well, if you speak the truth will set you free, Dr. Cohen.
Yeah, paranoia is the unreasonable fear that people are out to get you.
Yeah.
Now, right. Quite clearly, the mere fact that the director was testifying, knowing, and by the way, it's not unusual that the questioner knows the answers. That's true with every lawyer asking questions in courtrooms or testifying. Yeah. But it's also not unusual that the witness be unaware of the questions. Almost always the questions are vetted in advance with the legislative office of the agency. At least that's how it was when I was there. Yeah. So he should not have been surprised.
Yeah.
It was an ego thing. Why was he there? He should have anticipated the questions or actually had them, and he should have been there with the people who know. I'll give an example. Elsewhere in the government, where it's about the only thing that seems to be working, in my opinion, right now, Dr. Anthony Fauci, who's a national resource, he's not the director of the NIH. He's the director of one of the institutes, mm-hmm. the Institute of Allergy and Infectious Diseases, where all of the research and work is being done. You don't see Dr. Collins, the director of NIH, saying, me, I'm going to go down and testify. No, he sends the people who know. Right. And Tony is always there with 2 or 3 or 4 of the other people from his institute who will be expert in specific questions such as therapeutics or vaccines, or environmental persistence of the virus, epidemiology of the virus, etc. Redfield doesn't do that. CDC doesn't do that. CDC hasn't done that in a long time.
Yeah. He seemed totally unprepared and came off, frankly, as just, a political hack who was running an agency and really didn't know what the agency was. But that aside, I did think it does speak to the underpinnings of that the CDC just really was not prepared for this. They're laying it off a lot now, the White House is, on red tape. That it was so much of a labyrinth to work through this because of red tape. Is that a fair criticism of the CDC, or is it all leadership at the top?
It's all leadership at the top, and it's not just the very top. It's multiple layers all the way down. Ken, let me tell you what is an unfortunately well-kept secret. Sort of the how do you fly the Jedi Knight through the labyrinth and the Death Star to get to the middle? The core of this whole outbreak, now pandemic in the U.S., was a failure to test. Everything else we might well have been able to scramble and deal with. We had no idea who was infected or where the infection was. CDC spent at least 3 weeks, maybe as long as 6 weeks, not just CDC, but the U.S. government, FDA as well, probably 6 weeks refusing to use the WHO test or the Korean test or other tests for the virus that were being used elsewhere in the world where clearly we had a gigantic infectious disease problem looming. Mm-hmm. So they could take the time to develop their own. And then when they developed their own, they lost another 2 to 3 weeks because it didn't work. Who made those decisions?
Yeah.
Pardon me.
No, you're right. And I think that's, as I said, there will be plenty of time to assess what the underlying problem was, but it does seem like that this was a giant failing and a failure to realize on the part of the CDC. Now that we've established that, the problem is really at the top, help me with some other things that are going on. We have a senator in this state of Ohio, a man by the name of Sherrod Brown, who's making hay on the fact that apparently the president fired the entire global health security team at the White House 2 years ago. Does that in any way, shape, or form fold back on the desk of the president when they asked him yesterday, do you take any responsibility for the way this has germinated throughout our country? Is that a fair criticism of President Trump?
100%. He's not making hay. I don't know the senator, but he's not making hay. This is absolutely correct. As I mentioned, there were problems in the response.
Dr. Cohen, can I just put you on hold for a minute? We're going to go. The president is speaking at the White House, so just stand by, if you will. Can you hang on for me?
Sure. I'm
okay.
Happy to.
All right. Thank you. All right. Let's go to the White House, and here is the president speaking at this hour.